Hey there, everyone. Today I would like to talk about Michel Foucault's concept of disciplinary apparatuses. This is a very important concept in postmodern philosophy because it represents a usurpation of an understanding of subjectivity that has reigned in modern philosophy for a long time. It's traced all the way back to Plato, really, but it gets formalized in Descartes' method, where the subject is presumed to underlie and a certain view of the subject authorizes certain assumptions about ontology and about the knowledge of entities in our world. And what Foucault wants to do is he wants to recenter a viewpoint that we see expressed in Plato's Republic by Thrasymachus. Thrasymachus is part of a larger conversation in the early books of the Republic, talking about what is the good. And he says that the good is the right or the will of the strongest. Basically saying that the good does not precede power, but in fact emanates from and is caused by power. And Foucault wants to recenter power relations and thus really politics, because politics is the management of power, both conceptually and physically. He wants to recenter this as the sort of structuring discourse through which we understand systems. And with disciplinary apparatuses, really the heart of what Foucault is trying to understand is how do we come to understand ourselves as a subject and as a subject of something, a subject of the state, for example. Because one of the things that we see in modern philosophy that thinkers like Foucault are very wary of is certain generalizations about what it means to be a subject, to be the kinds of entities that we are, that think in the ways that we do and interact with other entities in the way we do, which is that the subject is assumed in a lot of modern thought. Look at Descartes, look at Hobbes, look at Locke, look at Kant, to be something that can essentially bracket the rest of the world and think autonomously in an inner way, right? It has a sort of inner domain, which is thought. For Descartes, the cogito, the entity that we are, is a thinking thing. We are defined by thinking, and thinking is something abstract. It doesn't depend on any empirical content, any matters of fact in the world. It is something rational, something that occurs via relations of ideas in the mind. So it is essentially an internal phenomenon first. And Foucault is wary of this because this takes for granted, in fact, it obfuscates questions of power, of sociality, of the relations in the world diffuse throughout the social field that explain the kinds of entities we are as a result or as an effect. Foucault sees thinkers like Descartes, and we might also put Hobbes and Locke in here, as taking for granted certain produced effects of what the subject is. And Foucault wants to look at disciplinary apparatuses as one of the main loci that establishes the view of the subject that we take for granted today. Now let's unpack this a little bit. What do we mean by disciplinary apparatuses? Well, examples would be schools, prisons, courts, families. These are basically localized nodes that are subject to power and are responsive to general rules of focalization, of localization, of distribution. So they hierarchize entities within them in order to distribute power, in order to reinforce certain existing power relations. So think about the prison, for example. You have prisoners, and they, by being in the prison, are assumed over by the state. So the state is authorized as a power which has the right to withhold certain rights from people. And the way that the state typically discusses and authorizes the prison is that you sign the social contract in advance, and thus you authorize the state. But Foucault wants to say that this assumes a naive view of the subject that we see in the very founder of social contract theory, Rousseau and Hobbes. Because Hobbes, for example, is going to look at the state and he wants to find a way to justify the state. And in order to do this, he has to imagine a pre-social relationship and a pre-social system, which is the state of nature. It is humans completely divorced from relations between each other and solely reliant on themselves, in opposition to and entrenched in nature, trying to survive. This would be the lone forager who is, has all the rights that they can possibly express, and then they come into contact with other people and they create contractual obligations with each other. So all obligations are a result of rational choice for Hobbes, right? I rationally come to the conclusion, and therefore institute the social contract, that it would be better if I didn't kill you and you didn't kill me. And therefore, we authorize social relationships on the back of the view of the subject as autonomous and essentially extrasocial or pre-social. Foucault thinks this is a bad idea. This is in fact not how society works. There is not a pre-social understanding of individuals. In fact, individuals are already always social and are constituted as individuals insofar as they participate in a multiplicity or a system of some kind. Think about, the family. The family, in some meaningful way of a minimal unit of biological reproduction, has always been with us because it is the precondition for any individual to be birthed. So there really is no essentially singular subject, historically speaking, anthropologically speaking, biologically speaking. And this is a fundamental ontological position which affirms multiplicity, which Foucault sees as being acknowledged in systems, right? That there are systems of entities. And what we want to understand is not merely the concatenation of entities, but the preconditions and assumptions of a system that allow for the production of entities in those particular ways. And for Foucault, this would be the subject. How is it that we come to understand ourselves as subjects of particular systems beholden to particular rules? In this case, how do we come to understand ourselves as these rational, autonomous subjects who therefore have always already signed the social contract and therefore have acceded to the rules of the state and therefore authorize or justify the state putting one in prison if one disobeys a rule? And of course, this becomes contentious when we question the rules of the state and, question whether or not the state is authorized or just in every single one of its laws. Because then we have this question of, well, to what extent have we already acceded to that law tacitly just by consenting to live in the society we do? So we quickly become petrified and paralyzed from looking at the deeper kind of historical dynamics that have led to the development of the state. And disciplinary apparatuses come in here to institute and authorize the supposed authors of themselves, namely the subject. So Foucault's point is that the rational, autonomous individual does not precede the socius, but in fact is concurrent with, equiprimordial with the socius, and cannot be disentangled from it. And furthermore, it is an effect produced by power relations. So with the court, for example, Foucault has said this, that in fact the court or the judge begs for their authority to be recognized, because in so doing, we're really recognizing our autonomous decision to give them authority that they then use against us. So it's a way to authorize our own oppression under the pretenses that we authorize this in advance, when in fact Foucault's point is that power authors, right, literally creates the subject and creates it in such a way that it is under the rules, under the preconditions, under the presuppositions of power that therefore authorizes certain social relations. So patriarchy is a good example, right? Patriarchy is a systematic pressure applying to certain entities, namely to women, right? It subjugates women, and it confirms men as the authors of social institutions, as the legitimate authorities, as the ethically privileged subjects when it comes to making decisions in government or in the family or in schools, right, in education. And this is embodied and in fact caused by disciplinary apparatuses like the school, for example, where you look at administration, which has tended historically to be male, and therefore men are really holding the reins of pedagogically what gets decided to be allowed to be taught to the students, and teachers are very often female, and there's a strange sort of dominant role that women have, but only as caregivers of and authors of male children who will go on to usurp them in the workforce and who will get more lucrative jobs. And we also look at the family, right? The family is a fundamentally patriarchal institution. Think of the way in the Bible women are understood in the family unit as essentially merchandise or property of their husbands. And before they are property of their husbands, before they have a husband, they're the property of their father. So these are different family relations, and women get exchanged from being subservient to the father to subservient to their husbands. And in either case, if either of these die, the next male authority becomes their owner. So in this case, a brother or a cousin or an uncle, right? So we see in the family power relations being reinforced, and the thing about disciplinary apparatuses that makes them so successful is that they reproduce themselves by reproducing their assumed subjectivity, which they create. And then those subjects feed back into the system to reinforce it. So this is an autopoietic, stochastic system where an output, an effect of the system becomes an input, which the system covertly claims is the precondition of the system, the authorization of the system that makes its laws not arbitrary, makes them universal, in fact. And this is so successful that it makes it hard to question the family, the state, the school, the prison, to question these relations that we have to each other, and furthermore, the presuppositions that authorize the types of actions that we see as us being allowed to do with each other. So disciplinary apparatuses, this is what is important for Foucault, and he discusses this in both Madness and Civilization and Discipline and Punish, to name kind of two principal examples, is it has been understood that the state is an oppressive instrument, right? Even Hobbes understands this. The state is an overarching coercive authority, as Hobbes puts it, and it suppresses subjects from being able to enact certain rights of theirs that otherwise they would have in the state of nature. And it does this on the grounds that all subjects participating in this contractual obligation agree to lay down that right. And they do it because they are being forced by the state to do it, because the state, as a third party, arbits the relationship and assures the continual meeting of that contractual obligation by fear, by threat, by coercion. And Foucault's point is not simply just that the state is coercive. In other words, that it takes away from some pre-social state, namely the maximally free, maximally autonomous subject, which is then, taken down a few pegs so that it can meet with the rest of everybody else in a sort of productive ground state. But Foucault wants to say that disciplinary apparatuses are productive. They do not merely take away from a pre-social subject, but they create a subject equiprimordial with the socius and claim that that after effect is actually the precondition of the socius. So there are a bunch of ontological and epistemological errors that can be politically covered up because it is advantageous to power, and thereby can authorize views of the subjects which take on the appearance of being universal and eternal. So what Foucault is doing here is essentially genealogical, as he puts it. It is a historical unearthing of the development of assumptions of an epistemological framework, right? Of the episteme, which authorize social relations, which authorize the reproduction of power relations. In so doing, he provides a contextualized, historicized understanding of absolutes like the cogito, the I, the subject, in a way that deconstructs them, finds their gaps, and finds the fact that they are not some essential thing, some firm foundation, as Descartes would have liked to think, right? Descartes builds his epistemology on the firm foundation of the cogito, of the thinking thing, of this abstract, rationalistic, thinking subject. But in fact, Foucault wants to say it is not such a thing. This has been historically produced, and it has been so effectively historically produced that it seems to be primary, to precede social relations, when in fact it is an effect of social relations. So this is a crucial concept that has so much influence on the changing understanding of epistemology and philosophy as a whole towards something like cultural criticism, to historicism, where no longer do we see the social as merely an after effect, in that philosophy can precede or exclude the social. No, the social and the political, and therefore the ethical, become fundamentally entrenched in the way that we view philosophy. And philosophy now becomes a question of social discourse. So that being said, that's it for this lecture. I've done a lot of other lectures on Foucault talking about things like power and madness and the subject in more detail if you're curious about some of the implications of these ideas, because really this is just a starting point for understanding the way that Foucault kind of influences the history of philosophy and some of the key intersections between he and other thinkers. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to one-time donate to the channel, because it helps me purchase the books necessary to thrive as a student trying to also produce these videos alongside my studies. That being said, that's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.